Hey everyone, I am so glad to see you here. I hope everybody is well. My name is Hilary Stupa, and I am a developer at Qdabra Software. And today I want to talk to you about using the HTTP, the SharePoint HTTP request action in Power Automate, and some of the great ways you can extend your Power Automate flows with this fantastic action. So there are some things that are missing, right? There's some stuff in Power Automate or Flow that we look for that isn't there, that just kind of feels like boy, I wish I could still do this, or boy, I wish I could do that. And the HTTP request can help you work around these things. It's extremely powerful because anything the SharePoint REST API can do, you can pretty much do with this HTTP request action. And it's just included, right? It's not premium, it's just included with your Power Automate stuff that you get with your Office 365 license because it's talking to SharePoint. It's meant for interacting with SharePoint. There's some common use cases I've seen, and those are mainly the ones I'm going to highlight today. You can get group members. Let's just say you'd like to email a group. That's certainly a common enough scenario. You can set really granular permissions. You can update columns in a list like a hyperlink, and there's also the ability to set a single person or group picker to null, which is still not available in the out-of-the-box update a list item action. You can use the HTTP request to get around some problems you might run into if you have any lists that are over the lookup threshold, which I think we've all occasionally run into one or two of those. And I just found out yesterday, thanks to one of my awesome clients who had a problem she was trying to solve, that you can filter on tricky columns like calculated columns by using a camel query and get items. So I kind of threw that in here at the last minute. We'll take a look at that. And of course, the most important thing to being able to do any of this is going to be understanding the documentation. So we'll take a quick look at the documentation so we can all kind of get a sense of, how to read this stuff, right? Not be intimidated by it. Not that you guys are. Sometimes I am, right? And so it's good to take a look at that documentation and get a feel for how to read it. So, some of the misses, well, you can't just email a group. You can't replace permissions the way we could with our SharePoint Designer 2010 workflows. Completely removing permissions isn't really there. You can't set a hyperlink column, can't set a single person or group field to blank. It's just a big world of can't. Using a dynamic value for the list or library and item actions is problematic because you either won't have the dynamic content available to you if you use get item, and if you use update item and you try to use a dynamic list or library name, none of the fields will be available because obviously Power Automate doesn't know what list or library you're going to be using. All of these scenarios can be rescued, right, with the HTTP request action. So I'm going to kind of demo as we go here and just sort of show you things. I do have a single Power Automate flow with little samples of all this stuff in it. I'll export that so you guys can grab that when you grab the slides and the video and the rest of the webinar package, because sometimes it's just useful to have samples of these things. So we can't email a group using any built-in action. But with the HTTP request, we can get either the group ID, which we can use for permissions, or we can go ahead and just get the members of the group directly using the group name. And let's just take a look at this. Now, the one challenge you may have, depending on your comfort level with writing paths to JSON objects and properties, you might have a challenge getting the data back from the JSON, and we can take a look at that. I want to show you this link, there's a link to this page in the slide notes. This is really helpful if you're looking at getting group information or user information. So if you want to get, site members from a group, here's a sample. When you're searching, you don't have to search for just stuff about Power Automate. You also are going to want to search for just the REST API stuff in general. So here's my flow. So dealing with groups, you can see I used scopes in here a lot, and I've got this terminate step I'll be dragging around, and that's just because I'm easily bored and I don't want to have to run the entire flow every single time to see the results. So I usually have a terminate step somewhere that I kind of drag around and put in various places so I don't have to wait for the whole flow to run. So I'm using a compose step for the group name. I could envision instead that this group name would be coming from a person or group picker in a list or some other data source such as that. So here's my group. If I want to get just the group ID back, I can send a web request that looks like this. Site groups, get by name. Here's my group name. You can see it's in quotes there. And in this case, I'm just selecting the ID. I usually test my GET REST requests. I usually test those in the browser. For post, it's just as easy to test in Power Automate as it is to set up like Postman or something like that to test those. So those I normally just test here in Power Automate. So here is a query that's just getting back the ID for my group, and you can see there's the ID right there. I've highlighted it. If you wanted to see all the properties so you knew what you could select, it would just be site groups, get by name, and the name of your group. And that's going to bring back all of the properties of the group. Now, obviously, reading XML in the browser is not anybody's favorite experience. It's a little hard to read. So I usually use a text editor that has syntax highlighting, like Notepad++. I usually use the XML tools too, so I can get indents and syntax highlighting. But you can see these are the properties that you can get back for the group. That's how you know what you can add to your select statement. You can use select ID, you can do select on any of these that you wish to. Maybe you want the description for some reason, okay? So now we've got the ID back, and that's what's going to be returned with this query, is just the ID. Here's another query. This one's going to get just the group members. And you can see here, I'm doing just a select email. Once again, if we pop over here and take a look, you can see here's all the different emails of the users. But if you wanted all the properties of your users, right, you can do something like that. And again, a little tough to read in the browser, but you can copy it out. So this gives you a sense of what kinds of things you can select. It gives you a sense of what kind of data is returned. But then how do we get back, for example, this ID? I think, to me, the easiest way to understand what the data looks like is to run the flow. So I'm going to move my terminate step up. I'm going to hit save. And I'm just going to go ahead and test. And this will run quickly because it's not doing much. Just pop that over. And we're going to run from a previous test. I've got a couple little input parameters on this guy that I was using for dynamic list information. So we're just going to let this run. Super fast because we terminated. And so you can see it stopped right there. So if we look here, we can see what our data looks like. This output, this body, is what was returned from our REST request. So if we wanted to get this, let's go paste this into Notepad so it's a little easier to look at. And this is JSON, right? And again, we can, this is why I'm such a Notepad++ fangirl, right? I can set my syntax. Okay, so if I wanted to get back the ID from this JSON, the identifier would look like D ID, okay? And you can see that right here. When you look at it, you can see here we've got D, and then underneath it, just ignore our metadata. We don't really care about that. right? Underneath it, we don't need anything from that. Underneath it, we've got, I took out a parenthesis that was going to break something, but I'm just trying to make a point here. Then you can see we've got the ID identifier. So DID will get us that. You can also, and you will also see in JSON syntax, this question mark. And that means don't freak out if ID isn't there. Now look, you and I know that as long as this returns data, ID will be there. But you know, it's just a little safety thing. I usually do add the question mark. So if we do another edit here and a quick compose step, and we're going to look at a couple other things before we run this again, but I just want to show you how you can get back that that ID without actually parsing the JSON. So we know what the JSON path looks like, and we should be able to just paste it in here, but we also need to get the body from here. So if we go here, back to our dynamic content, and it's this request, send an HTTP request to get group ID, right? So now our full expression looks like outputs, send an HTTP request, blah, 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 question mark, body. I'm going to put a question mark there, DID. So we grabbed this first piece from the dynamic content, and then the second piece we wrote ourselves. And I'm just going to say, okay, I don't always trust the expression builder to put my expression in there. So a lot of times I peek code afterwards to make sure it's right. And peeking code is also a good way to see what the syntax looks like. So if you pick something from dynamic content and you're curious what this path, this JSON path looks like, you can use peek code to get a sense of that. It's a good learning tool. Okay, so now we've got our ID there just because it was interesting to grab that. I'm going to go ahead and move my terminate step back down. Now, here we've gotten our group members, and I'm going to loop through the results here to get back the group member emails. And you can see this shows body D results. Now this looks like it was picked from the dynamic content, but once again, I had to handwrite that path. And how we would know what that path looks like, we can look at the returned data again. This returns an array, this query that returns the users of a group. It returns an array, and the array is results. I'm going to open this questions page. How do you get sound? Hopefully everybody else can hear me. We have one user who is not getting audio. I'm going to just reply. I'm not sure. Okay, thank you, Nicole. I'm not sure why you don't have sound. Okay, sorry, you guys. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just kind of like, whoops. Yeah, so Cindy, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be able to hear me apologizing. Okay, so back we go. All right, so let's take a look at this. Thanks for reassuring me, guys. I'm like, oh no, tell me my audio is not malfunctioning. Let's come back here and take another look. I leverage the data returned constantly to get a sense of what I can get back. So we can see here's D, right? We know about D now. And here's results, and results are the array of results. Not going to bother copying it out for you this time, but usually I go and take a look at the output returned, and then from there you can handwrite the path. Now you can also use parse JSON for that. And here is a sample for a parse JSON step. What I usually do here, you can see my content is the body from get group members. And you're looking at this and you're like, well, how would I know what the schema is, right? That is an excellent question. How would you know what the schema is? You copy the results here. You copy that. And then you can pop back over here, click generate from sample, insert the sample data, right? And click done. And when you do that, the schema will get created for you. So that's just a little tip for you to be aware of. You don't have to write the JSON schema here by hand. The one thing you want to watch out for when you do it this way is you watch out for that required getting created. So you guys probably know that if a field is blank in a SharePoint list, that field doesn't get returned at all in your query. So this required could cause you some validation errors, schema validation errors, and you can always bloop, backspace that out, right? So you can always do that. So if you wish to parse JSON instead, and then if you went to add an action, and I'm going to hit apply to each, and you didn't want to write your JSON selector by hand, you can see now we parse the JSON, and you'll see results right there, and then you can do something with each email. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just delete that step because we don't need it. In this case, I hand wrote, the results path to the JSON, and then I'm appending each email to an array. And finally, here I'm using a join step to join this email array. Now, all of a sudden, I've got all my emails, they're semicolon separated, and I can send an email to my group using that. So if we just hit save, and we're going to test one more time, hopefully it will save and test. We can take a look at that compose step and see how all of our emails are joined. So there's what I'm trying to get across here is there's a variety of ways to consume the data once it comes back from the request, but you need to be prepared for a little bit of complexity. It's not just going to show up nicely in your dynamic content. You're going to have to use, for example, compose steps. Here's my group ID of 7, right? Or you're going to have to use parse JSON, so that you can use the dynamic content down the road instead of having to handwrite these paths. You can handwrite the paths, and as you can see as we go through these, each one gets added to my array variable. Here's all my group users, and here in my compose step, you can see they were all joined. So that's a little bit of information on what you can do just with groups for getting group information. If we go back to the slides, we did the demo on that. Permissions. So I don't know if anybody here got bit by the SharePoint 2010 workflow deprecation in Office 365. They'd said that they were going to turn that off November 1. They actually turned it off on Friday the 13th. So if you did, these HTTP request steps can help you rebuild some of your permissions related SPD 2010 workflows. The built-in actions that we have grant access, and we have stop sharing. So those are the two built-in actions, and they are not without their uses. Okay, these do have utility to them. If you use grant access, it's pretty straightforward. You just enter a user's email address, and it grants access to those specified users. You guys already can tell that obviously if it uses an email address, there goes your ability to grant access to a SharePoint group, right? That's something you'll have to use HTTP request for. But for individual users, grant access is fine. It does remove inheritance. It does not remove existing permissions. So if you've got a library or a list with existing permissions, and then you use grant access on an individual item, those existing permissions will remain, inheritance will be broken, and the new email addresses that you add will be given access. There's 2 roles listed for you to select from. You can also use a custom role ID. I'll show you how to find the syntax on that. There's also a built-in stop sharing action. It deletes the links giving access. So if there's been any sharing links sent around, it gets rid of those. And then it also removes anyone with direct access except owners. And in a lot of cases, that's probably fine. That's probably adequate. But you are most likely going to end up with some scenarios where you literally need to remove access for everyone, in which case stop sharing isn't going to do that for you. With the HTTP request, you can check and see if inheritance has already been broken on an item. Perhaps there's things you don't want to do unless it's already been broken. You can remove permissions, but leave the inherited permissions, much like grant access does, except for grant access, you have to add permissions for somebody. You can remove permissions completely, except for the account making the request. Okay, so my account is used for the HTTP request action in the flow Therefore, my account will have full control over the item once I execute this REST call. And that is because SharePoint is not going to let me shoot myself in the foot and completely lock everybody out of an item. You can remove permissions for specific users and for specific roles. So you can remove, read access for so-and-so, but leave them with some other access. And you can restore permission inheritance, which becomes kind of important along the way. Now, the role def IDs, if we go back here, we talk about using a custom role ID for non-listed roles. I'm going to get back over to my web browser here. We can find out, let's take a look, let's get rid of, we're going to shrink you up, drag you down. Whoop. When we use grant access, you can see right here we've got the roles of can view or can edit. Edit is different from contribute. View is read, I'm pretty sure. But if you take a look at peak code here, you can see right here what we have to pass in there. Role, colon, and then the role ID. So how do we get the role ID? We go back to REST. We use API web role definitions as the call. I'm going to go ahead and again copy this out so we can look at it a little more easily. I'm going to put it here. Okay, and so now we can see the different role IDs. So that's full control, that's design. This is, what's your ID? Edit, right? And so on. And so if we pop back over here to our flow, wrong window, we can see that one's using that role. Okay, and that's the read permission. So view and read are the same thing. I honestly wasn't sure, but edit and contribute are not the same thing. So if I wanted to give somebody contribute permissions here, I could just copy that role and find my web browser again, say done here, and we could do enter custom value, role, colon, right? All right, and that's how you can give someone access of a role type that is not available in that dropdown. Again, though, grant access, you have to have an email address. And go ahead and hit save on that, and then we'll take a quick look at the rest of these permissions. And again, I'm going to send you guys a copy of this, so you've got it to take a look at. So you can check role inheritance. That uses basically the items query, and we're using select has unique role assignments, returns true or false. Okay, and so here's a compose step that shows how to get back that. I'm using the outputs, the body D has unique role assignments. Okay, and you can, again, if you need to look at the expression that's used to get the JSON, you just peek code there. I do that all the time. I'll do this in one flow and then I'll go back to it and I'll have to use peek code to find the JSON path again. If we want to restore permissions, we can use reset role inheritance. So this is important for you to know. I worked recently with a client on something where the item's permissions were changed based on a status field in the item. So the person who submitted it got set to read, and some approvers got set to contribute, and then after the approvers had approved it, it got switched back and the approvers got read access as well. If you have already broken permissions and you need to remove permissions entirely again, you need to reset them first. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that if you're modifying permissions repeatedly, before you break permissions again, you have to restore them. Now, to completely break inheritance, you use break role inheritance and you set copy role assignments to false. Okay, if you set copy role assignments to true, then anyone who currently has permission will continue to have permissions when inheritance is broken. So you've got 3 groups that have permissions on the library. If you break role inheritance and leave copy role assignments to true, those 3 groups will still have permissions. Sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes it isn't, okay? And so completely breaking permissions requires copy role assignments equals true. I think I have that backwards in my comments. So let me just fix that. I'm telling you one thing while my comment says another thing. Completely breaking permissions requires false. And the documentation on that is here. And it is copy role assignments. If the value is false, the collection of role assignments must contain only one role assignment containing the current user after the operation. That clear as mud for all of us? That, not at all surprising why I got that backwards. So basically what this says is that if we set copy role assignments to false, then the only role assigned will be whoever ran it. Okay, and if you leave it to true, then it copies over whoever currently has permissions. Just worth knowing. Okay, and clear subscopes. I think subscopes is related to child items. Yep, child securable objects. Okay, so clear subscopes is your child item. So let's pretend that this is a folder or a document set, right? If you also want to have this take effect on your child items, you would leave clear subscopes to true. Okay. Now, if we want to give a group permissions, or if you have a user's ID, their integer ID of the user, not their email address, and you want to grant a user permissions, you use role assignments, add role assignments, and please note these are post requests. Note the method is post. You set the principal ID to the ID of whoever you wish to grant permissions to. There's a comma there, don't miss that, I did yesterday. And then the role def ID, again, back to the role definitions. You can find those in your role definition query that looks like this, right? And so you have to have that ID. You will find online like the IDs for some of the levels, like full control, edit, read. But you might as well just query your own environment, and then that way you know you've got any of your custom permission levels as well. It only takes a second, it just makes sense. Okay, and let me see here. Back we go. So that's how you grant your permissions. If you want to remove permissions for a group or a user, you go ahead and you use remove role assignment, and we've got again the ID of the group or person which you wish to remove the role for, and the actual role ID. And that's how you would remove, say, for example, you want to take away someone's edit permissions, but if they've got read, you want to leave those, okay? Hopefully this makes sense. You can combine these different actions in a variety of ways to do what you need to do, and you can use these as well as the built-in actions. You just need to kind of be aware of what's happening when. So we're going to drop this right here, and I have I've got this set to run on a specific item. So I've got his permissions page pulled up. I'm going to go ahead and delete those unique permissions so that we're back to normal here. Okay, so here's my guy. He's back to normal. And let's go ahead and test this. And we'll do test. We're just going to test with our previous data. And we're going to let this run till it terminates, which it's always fun to watch the little wheel spin. Okay, so here we are in dealing with permissions, and you can see here's my terminate step. So we checked the role inheritance, and I had already set it back to inherit. So you can see has unique role assignments returned false. In other words, it's inheriting. Here's the response. It just shows how to get that data back. And then I went ahead and restored permissions again. Notice that that doesn't throw an error, so it doesn't really care. If it's inheriting permissions and you tell it restore permissions, it's like, okay, fine, whatever. It does not care. And then now here we broke permissions, and this should have left just me with permissions. So let's refresh this guy again, and you can see just I have permissions now on this. So if we edit it again, and I'm going to go ahead and drag this guy down and out here. And here I am. We're going to drag him up here. to grant group permissions so that you can see when we get a permission group granted. And then that's probably enough show and tell on this particular thing. But I just wanted you to have a sense of what you can do here and any little gotchas. And I'll send you this flow so you can play with it a little bit. Obviously, in your environment, you'll have to change a few things, right? That's going to have the wrong URLs and everything. But you can see now my test group has read permissions. So that's kind of a sense of what we can do with permissions, with the built-in and with the custom HTTP request stuff. Finally, managing list items. So you can't set hyperlinks, and the other thing you cannot do in an update item step is you can't set a single person or group picker to null. It's extraordinarily annoying. If you have a multiple person group picker, you can set that to null and blank it out, but not a single one. So you can use the HTTP request to update those columns. You can also use the HTTP request to work with list items where you have threshold issues. So if you have stuff that's past the lookup column threshold, you can generally get around that by using an HTTP request. I was working on a site recently where we couldn't use update item in Power Automate because of the list threshold issues, and we couldn't use get item. So using HTTP request was what we had. And you can also use it for flows where you may need to use a dynamic list or library name. And I've had to do this in a couple cases where we've had maybe lists that were exactly the same on several different sites. So the site URL needed to be dynamic. Lists that had the same column names, but the list name was different. So we needed to use a dynamic list name there. And if you use a variable in the update item action, it won't give you any of the fields so you can populate them. So you end up needing to use an HTTP request. And then also, as I mentioned, I just found out yesterday that you can use the get items method. And with the get items method, you're able to pass in a camel query. So you can query on filter on something like a calculated value, a calculated SharePoint column, which is not possible with REST. Okay, so here we are, and I just want to show you these last things in my sample flow once I get back here. Boom. Okay, and so dealing with permissions, let's roll that guy up. I'm going to get rid of my terminate step. I don't think I'm using any of that stuff for this, so we'll just scooch things around a little. All right, list items. Okay, so one scenario I was thinking about was setting content type IDs, setting your content type, and there is the ability in the update item action to set a content type, but you do need to have the content type ID for that if it's going to be custom, if it's not something that's available in the dropdown. So you can use a web request to get back the available content types in your site. And that can be helpful if you need to set a content type ID. So I included that just for kind of info. The list entity type, if you're going to use items, the items service to update or create a list item, you are going to need the list item entity type. It's just part of what you see here. And in order to do an update, that's part of what you have to pass in the body, and it's unique to every list. I mean, it's usually like sp.data. Something, something, something. But it's worth requesting so that you know you've got the right thing instead of just guessing. So I'm going to clean this up a little, customers, and select this. And we'll just take a quick look at the data that we get back from that. And again, you can always just query for it and have it. But if you're in a situation where the list, wow, that was nice. If you're in a situation where the list that you're querying is, or the list that you're going to update varies according to a piece of data passed in, like if the sector equals public, then we want it to go to this list. If the sector equals private, we want the data to go to that list. Both lists have the same column names. it's a good practice to just go get this each time. And in most cases, it's going to be sp.data. Whatever the list name is, list item, but why not just query for it? It's just one extra little query step. So we get the list entity type. Here I'm using a parse JSON step, so you've got another sample of that to get back our list item entity type full name, and then I could use the dynamic picker down here to add this. And in this case, I'm creating my my list. I'm picking my list and creating my title from data from my initial run of the flow. And we can also update a hyperlink column here. Hyperlinks are tricky. You have to pass in the metadata that it's a field URL value, and then you can do the description in URL. This is my column name, okay? And once again, we need to use the list entity type. You can see we've got some special headers we need to pass here. You will find this stuff online if you search with the headers and stuff. We'll take a look at the documentation so you can also see how to find that in the docs. The easiest way to enter your headers for me is to change it to text and just enter it. But that's just because I normally just copy paste it from one to the next if I'm doing this, if I'm updating an item. So if you're updating an item, you want to make sure you've got the right headers in here. Here is a sample of how to clear a person. So owner is the name of my column, and it's always going to be the ID. So you don't see that field in your list, but if you look at the returned list data, you do see it, and you set it to -1, and that will clear out a person for you. And it looks like I'm doing second company's item 1 here. So let's just, oh, that's a nice bit of test data, isn't it? Let me just go ahead and put an owner in here, and that'll get cleared when we run this. Back we go. Okay. And then finally, the last thing I've got going on here is a sample of the thing I mentioned to you of using a camel query. So you can pass in, I was so excited about this, you guys. You can pass in a camel query to get items, and it allows you to filter. That was nicely done, wasn't it? It allows you to filter on columns that you can't filter on in a regular REST query. So if you need to filter on a calculated column, for example, you can use a camel query to do that. So this is just kind of a bonus piece of information. I was super stoked with how easy this was. So this list only has a couple items that match this criteria. There's one where month is 10 and one where month is 12. And so I was very pleased to learn about this yesterday and wanted to make sure I shared it with you. So I'm just going to hit save. We'll test this so we can take a quick look at the data. And hopefully I haven't, hopefully I haven't broken anything from the last time I tested it. And I'm going to pick second companies, and my input's going to be brand new item. We'll run our flow. So over here we should get, and I think it was regular companies that I was setting my URL to Google for my company URL, which is really useful. Yeah, it was. Yeah, so here's a recent new item that I set the URL column on. If we go to this guy, you can see here's my brand new item with Google, and you can see my name got cleared out here. So my person or group picker is blank. And then finally, the piece that was really the most exciting to me was this guy right here, where we can see if we look down through these results, I just literally don't understand why that box is so small. Control A, Control V. All right, so if we search here for month and we find all, there's only two. There's the 10 and the 12. So if you have a need to get items filtered on something that the REST query won't let you filter on, because even if you're using the built-in get items action, that uses REST. So you're limited there with whatever the REST API is going to let you use. Try this get items technique instead, and then you can use a camel query. Now the challenge here is, again, it's a post. You're not going to be checking this in the browser, but it's a single step. You could set up a flow with a that starts with a button, add your single step that just tries to do this query and gives you a little playground so you can mess around, try it, figure out what you need, and then you can go add it to your real, obviously more complicated flow. Okay, so I'm going to save all this stuff for you guys. You'll get that flow with the little samples in it. You'll get the slides. I want to talk briefly about the documentation though, because this is what unlocks it all, right? It's all well and good, you know, to know these things can be done, but it's the stumbling block is how. How do I do them? How do I apply this? How do I not get stuck, right? Now, generally, when I'm searching for stuff on the Power Platform, I constrain my search to the past year, and that's because so many things have changed so quickly. However, in this case, I would not recommend that, because really the REST API, the SharePoint REST API itself, it's been around for quite a while. And the types of things you can find about it may not necessarily be that recent, and they may not necessarily be in something about, you know, Power Automate. For example, you know, this right here, you know, they're just talking about using the REST API in general, or you'll find stuff where people are talking about custom JavaScript that they're doing for their SharePoint site. But all you really care about is these URL samples, right? This is the stuff you really care about, is like, oh, what method do I use to get back a site group by name? And so you don't want to constrain yourself too much when you're looking around. There's a list of endpoints, which I thought I had popped up here, but of course I couldn't be that prepared. So we've got a big list here of endpoints. I'm not expecting that any of us are going to memorize this, right? But it helps to look through it. You know, when you want to do something new that you're not sure about, you know, go look through this and you'll be like, oh, get file by server relative URL. Oh, get folder. You know, I need some folder information. It'll give you good search terms, right? You can, it gives you something to look at, and you'll be able to better then search, like role assignments. We just looked at role assignments, you know, role definitions. We just looked at that. But if you don't know what you're looking for, it's hard to find help, right? Where do you start to find out the information you need about what you need to do? And I feel like this list of endpoints is somewhat helpful. Another thing that's helpful for getting started is just this, the get to know the SharePoint REST service. Complete basic operations, work with lists and list items, folders and files, determine endpoint URLs, use OData query operations. So that's another thing that can be really helpful to you, is just kind of looking through this. I encourage you to use get queries in the browser as much as possible, just quick and easy. Check it out, see what you can learn there when you need to figure something out, like, oh, what's that user's ID? You know, oh, what's the permission level ID for that? Start using some of these REST APIs in the browser just to get comfortable with the syntax. I do it a lot with like quick filters or something to see what data lives in a list, and then go from there. The more comfortable you can kind of get with these queries and with the type of data returned from them, the more helpful this will be to you when you need to go do something and you're like, ah, man, Flow doesn't do that. I will bet you anything, if you're dealing with SharePoint, that Flow can do that. It's just a matter of knowing what REST API you need. Okay. Oh, and the Flow forums on Microsoft are actually pretty helpful. So, you know, the Power Automate forum. So if there's something you're trying to do, it's a good place to look. It's a good place to post. I encourage that. So does anybody, I know it was a lot of information as usual, and as always, I went over, and I'm sorry. I always have so much I want to share with everybody. Does anybody have any questions right now? If you don't, but you think of something later, you know where to find me. It's hillary.stupa@qdabra.com. You can email support@qdabra.com. But you'll all have my email address, because I'll send you out links to the YouTube, or links to the video and links to these materials later today. Just want to mention Forms Viewer. You're using InfoPath. You've got an investment in it. Forms Viewer can help you take that investment further into the future. So do check out Forms Viewer if you haven't yet. If you have a chance, take the survey at the end. Let me know what other things you'd like to learn about. And I hope everybody has a good holiday season and takes good care. And I'll talk to you again very soon. Thanks so much for attending. I really appreciate it.